Tonight, our speaker is Mr. Ronnie Forchheimer. He oversees digital media for ESPN.com. He was previously the coordinating producer for Outside the Lines, and maybe most importantly, he's an Emerson alum and played here on the basketball team. So, here we go.
You didn't say what year. It was 1981. Well, thank you for having me here. So first of all, I want to make this as informal as possible. So when Nadav was kind enough and Molly to invite me here, I was smitten and willing to come and anxious to share my story, but I had to ask them exactly what they wanted me to talk about because I wasn't really sure. So it was explained to me that, your group is interested in sort of career opportunities, sports business, marketing, kind of all of the above. And Nadav was telling me, well, if you just sort of explain sort of your career path, maybe that's a good basis for discussion, and you can see sort of how I took my route, and if it spurs any interest or any questions or comments, feel free along the way. So what I first wanted to do, I was curious, kind of about all of you. So maybe by a show of hands, how many of you are involved in journalism and marketing? And what else besides journalism and marketing? Communication studies, film. And so are you all interested in sports in some way, shape, or form, perhaps? Or are you just looking for a place to sit down? Okay. All right. All right. So what I'll do is I'll describe what I do now, and then I'll sort of backtrack to my humble beginnings and how we'll reverse engineer it on how I got there. So as Nadav said, I'm currently in charge of all the video on the digital platforms at ESPN. So that's ESPN.com, that's mobile, the phones, Facebook, YouTube. So we're basically, my group is responsible for sort of getting that video in two ways. One, we aggregate off of all the 4 linear television networks. Basically, we have a group that watches what's on television on ESPN 1, 2, ESPNU, all the linear networks, and sort of slices and dices the appropriate video content and then puts it on the various platforms, works with the various page editors, and they work on placing it and embedding it on the various platforms. The other group is the original content group, and they are actually doing original content. So they're doing everything from 5 to 7 minute segments geared for digital on NHL, NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, and we're also doing feature stories as well. A lot of that is sort of ad sales driven. So for you marketing types, a lot of that is sort of initiated by our ad sales group, who basically says, hey, can you do this? Because obviously it's an emerging market, especially in digital. The television market, as far as advertising and sales, is, it's fairly predictable. It's been around for years. People know what to expect. From my experience, I've had this job for a year now. As Nadav said previously, I was with Outside the Lines, and my background prior to that is pretty much all sports journalism and reporting. So it is the Wild West. I don't know how many of you are interested in digital media or digital video, but it is all burgeoning, and I can tell you from somebody on the inside, a lot of people are making it up as we go along. Technology is driving a lot of it, but I think the engineers in some way are ahead of the content people. I just went to a conference out in San Jose, that was called TV Next, like what's TV going to be next? And, it was in the Silicon Valley, and a lot of it was driven by, Facebook, Google, Apple. These are traditional, internet companies that are getting into the television business. And so they're now interested in putting their product on the big screen. And, I listened to a lot of people. A lot of it was like a lot of geek talk beyond me. And but what I could gather is that they can make stuff happen. They just don't know whether anybody wants to watch it and whether they can sell it. So it's in some ways the technology is ahead of content and business. And it's kind of like the internet was probably, in the late 90s to around 2000, where again people were creating things and they weren't really sure whether anybody was interested or whether anybody would buy them, but they could do it, so they were doing it. Any questions? Okay, I'll move on. All right, so that's where I am now. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'll do my whole life story in hopefully 10 minutes. Yes?
Actually, I have a question.
Yes.
What's the difference between screen and what goes on the web as opposed to what goes on TV, if there is one?
Good question. Some of it has to do with video rights. So we don't, at this point, are not buying, like when we make a deal with the NFL or Major League Baseball, there's TV rights and there's digital rights. And historically, digital rights are a lot smaller than the television rights. So we're restricted. Like for Major League Baseball, I think we can use like 3 minutes total on a given day. And so as you can well imagine, with 15 games, suddenly you're talking about 30-second video highlights, whereas television can go 3-4 minutes as much as they want. All right? Okay, so I grew up in New York, a place called Hartsdale, New York, which is just north of the Bronx. And I grew up the child of immigrant parents who fled Germany in the 30s. So I'm first generation. And my parents knew nothing about sports, nothing. Okay, so to this day, I throw a baseball left-handed and a football right-handed because when I was 5 years old, they took me to the toy store in town and said, get this boy a baseball mitt. He's right-handed. So what did they do? They got me a glove that went on my right hand. Okay. So I really just fell in love with sports. I don't know why. It wasn't because I sat around watching the game with my old man. As a matter of fact, when I was probably a little bit older, and it occurred to me, he didn't know the rules of baseball despite all the time I had spent in it. And one time I was just sitting, in the living room with him, and he was reading his New York Times, and I said, "Do you even know what a home run is?" And he said, "Yeah." He goes, "When they hit it out of the." I said, "Do you know what it is?" And he said, "Well, not really." And I said, "Well, it's when they hit the ball out of the state, out of over the fence." So we were watching the game. The game was on, and somebody hit a foul ball back behind the backstop, and he peers over his New York Times and he goes, "Home run." Okay, so that gives you some idea of what I was dealing with. So when I got older, I knew I liked sports, and I also, for some reason, fell in love with television, and probably for the most part because I had watched a lot of it. But by the time I was a teenager, I had a friend who was volunteering in New York City on 23rd Street at a place called ETC Studios. And that was the beginning of cable television, if you can think way back when. And New York City was one of the first places to have cable television. And part of the deal was they made a deal, basically, a law that we will put cable television channels on New York cable system in New York City, but you always have to reserve channels C and D for the public. Excuse me. So it was called public access, and basically for $25 in 1973, you could go in there and pay your $25, and you could do whatever you want. So if you've read history books, 1973, 1974 was a pretty wild time in this country, in the world, but in this country. So, by the time I was 14 or 15, I was just volunteering down there and running camera and shooting everything from live sex to people doing drugs to news analysis according to the Bible. I mean, basically anybody could come off the street, pay their $25, and, it's basically the equivalent of what you can do on a cell phone they were doing on public access. And there was no law really to stop them. Things have obviously changed, but that was the deal. So with this love of television and sports, it came time to go to college.